listener production.
Hey, Bension Siebert here with the briefing. Police have linked two violent attacks, both allegedly involving a teenager with a knife, to terrorism over the past month. The Perth knife attack over the weekend and the Wakeley church attack have put a renewed spotlight on teen radicalisation in Australia. But one of the aims of terrorism is, as the name suggests, to make us fearful as we go about our daily lives. So it's a good moment to step back and ask, how worried should we really be about young people, especially teen boys, becoming radicalised to the point of extreme violence? How big a problem is it really in Australia, and what is anyone doing to stop it? Internationally renowned expert on terrorism and extremism, Deakin University Professor Greg Barton is here to explain. Professor, how big is the issue of radicalisation of teenagers in Australia right now?
It's one of a number of significant challenges that we face, and it's linked with other challenges. So questions of male violence, domestic violence, mental health issues, exacerbated by homelessness and other problems are in the mix. When they manifest as violent extremism, that's actually the rare exception. The more common problems are broader kinds of violence, whether it's kids with knives, with no particular motivation that's politically oriented, gender-based violence. These are the bigger issues in our society. But in that, there is a vulnerability that is exploited by those trying to recruit young people, teenagers and 20-somethings, into a violent extremist cause. It's a resilient threat. A component which can be said to be far right, whether it's neo-Nazi or other kinds of, white supremacist exclusionary positions, that component is growing over time. The threat posed by groups linked historically with Al-Qaeda or Islamic State or other such groups hasn't declined. It's sort of stable, but there are worrying signs in terms of the global context that will begin to rise over the next few years.
We've seen these two stabbing attacks allegedly involving 16-year-olds in recent weeks, one at a church in Sydney in which a teenager was charged with committing a terrorist attack, and another in Perth over the weekend, which WA police said had the hallmarks of a terrorism-related incident. Should we consider these to be isolated incidents, or do they indicate anything about the radicalisation of teens more broadly? Where should we put this in the context?
Well, I think one thing that will help us frame this is we know from looking at this over the decades that radicalisation into violent extremism isn't something that one individual takes on a sort of lonely journey. They don't passively self-radicalise by watching YouTube videos. It's a social thing. So they perhaps look at a video, make some comments in the response section. Somebody reaches out, befriends them, persuades them that, that they respect them and that they want to talk with them further. Often the conversation goes into encrypted messaging chats, but it's then social. So we have historically in Australia had significant networks in the west of Sydney and in the north of south of Melbourne. We've had some troubles in Brisbane. Some individuals from Perth who have been radicalised but have joined Sydney networks. And that's the sort of the broader backstory. In the case of Perth, I think the key thing we can take from the Commissioner's comments is it does fit, the incident in his comments, fits the pattern of a terrorist attack, but they don't think there's anyone in the social circle physically that would go ahead and launch another attack. That was a concern in Sydney. And that's one reason why they've been cautious about flicking the switch and saying it's a counter-terrorism investigation. But complicating the story in both Sydney with the alleged stabbing of the bishop and this tragic stabbing and death in Perth, mental health is part of the vulnerability mix. Mental health doesn't explain it. Most people with mental health are not violent, but it is a vulnerability that's exploited, and it's not a passive thing. It's the exploitation takes place by predatory grooming, or at the very least by a circle of friends who move themselves towards greater extremism.
Are teenage boys more vulnerable to radicalisation?
Yeah, teenage boys are more vulnerable. They're more vulnerable than teenage girls. Teenagers are more vulnerable than people in their 20s. And by the time somebody's gone past their 30th birthday, their impulse control, their executive judgment, that maturation, which takes the first 3 decades of life to complete, you're at a point where you're much less likely to go and do something rash. So if somebody joins a violent extremist network, a social network, they've probably joined as a teenager or a 20-something. They may carry on through life, but it's rare for them to join later in life unless they're in a conflict zone or there's some other exacerbating factors. So yes, we need to recognise that this has to do both with the way we are as teenagers or 20-somethings, but also the predatory response that people who want to exploit that take advantage of. And we see it in other areas of life. We see it with criminal activity, with substance abuse. We see it with sexual abuse, unfortunately. There are people who look for opportunity, and teenagers are particularly vulnerable, and teenage boys are most vulnerable.
The Australian government has a program called Countering Violent Extremism. Could you tell us about what that is and how effective it's been?
Yeah, we sort of should break this apart a little bit and understand that what police do in detecting and disrupting terrorism is called counter-terrorism. It's best done by police. When we've tried to do it with military, it gets poor results or unintended consequences. So police working as they do in Australia, federal and state police with community groups and other agencies, that detection and disruption, we often don't hear about it. We hear about when they miss, when a goal goes through the net, as it were. That works very well, but police are very conscious of the fact that they need to work further upstream in prevention, but also in downstream, as it were, in rehabilitation. And so we do have formal countering violent extremism programs in the rehabilitation space for terrorism detainees and others at risk in the prison system. And then there's a whole lot of related programs that look out for early warning signs of kids in trouble, and they work with community groups to do early interventions to try and prevent radicalisation. And then there are other programs that community groups sort of develop themselves with government assistance in trying to build cohesion and resilience. So there's a whole raft of different initiatives in this so-called soft space of countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism as opposed to police counter-terrorism. The biggest threat historically has been in New South Wales and Victoria, so that's where the biggest programs are. The threats are much less demographically in South Australia and in Western Australia. There has been some historic problems in Brisbane, but because this is a very social thing, the key social networks all hub through Western Sydney and through the north and south of Melbourne.
Should authorities or social media sites be doing more to limit access to extremist material online?
Yeah, the extremist material online is a key part of this. It's not the only element, and there is no silver bullet or no singular solution. But certainly we should see, and we need to clearly put pressure on tech companies, social media platforms, to invest more in content moderation. X, formerly Twitter, used to have many hundreds of people working in content moderation, looking out for malign content. The same thing with groups like Instagram, Facebook, etc. What we're seeing now is that these platforms aren't investing in content moderation. They don't have the human eyeballs, as it were, keeping track of things. They have to use artificial intelligence to flag, red signs, but they need people to look at content. And so we're seeing platforms like TikTok and Instagram and Facebook used both for really bad content, and the content is a problem because it's pushed by algorithms, and then it leads to people forming relationships, and it's those social relationships which leads to the radicalisation process. But we also see groups actively messaging and recruiting through these platforms. So both really bad content and then the malign use of these platforms to recruit and to radicalise. And this won't be solved just with the tech platforms alone. There's no quick and easy fixes, otherwise it probably would have happened by now.
What should someone do if they are seriously worried about a teenager in their life? And what happens? What's the process?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question, because if somebody is getting drawn in, whether it's online or whether it's through friends in real life, there will be observable signs of behavioural change. So they will change their expression of strong ideas, extreme ideas. They'll perhaps become more transgressive when in the past they were not transgressive, sort of breaking rules, even breaking the law. And they will break off with old friends and family links and form new friends. So those three things happening simultaneously are big red flags. And just like a lifeguard at a beach is, trained to look out for warning signs, if she sees something, she does something because she sees signs that ordinary people swimming in the beach or at the pool don't see. So we can work with community groups. There are programs doing this training, but we do need to do more of this. And it's important if people see something to speak up and express concern. We now have really good services coordinated with police, but working with community groups that will make appropriate interventions and save things going badly wrong. We'd much rather have a conversation with police and some program of counselling, and which is done very discreetly to avoid shame and stigma. Much better to have that than to have something like what happened in Perth, where, tragically we don't know what went wrong, but even though there was early interventions, it wasn't enough to avert a tragedy, and that's exactly the worst case outcome. So speaking up when you see something, we should have confidence. We've got the systems in place, people who are trained, there will be a respectful response, and it's very often possible to do something. We saw literally hundreds of lives likely saved through 2015 through 2017 from people wanting to travel to Syria to join Islamic State. Family and friends spoke up and travel documents were stopped. People stopped from boarding aircraft. That saved lives.
And just very briefly, to be specific, that's calling the police?
Yes, it's often there's a hotline if you see concerns of extremism, radicalisation, and it coordinates with police. But it's not just a police-led response. Depending where you're living, there are community-led groups, there are psychologists, there are counsellors, people who will step in and help.
Greg Barton, thanks so much for your time today.
A pleasure. Thanks very much.
Professor Greg Barton there. That's it for the briefing today. Check your feed again tomorrow from 6 for the latest news headlines with Sasha Barbagat and I, plus another deep dive. And if you found this episode useful or you like what we do here at the briefing in general, then as a little treat, please tell a friend or 7 about the podcast. We really appreciate it. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you tomorrow.